This is a reading from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. This is a continuation of Akalabeth, the downfall of Numenor. In this age, as is elsewhere told, Sauron arose again in Middle-earth, and grew, and turned back to the evil in which he was nurtured by Morgoth, becoming mighty in his service. Already in the days of Tar-Minastir, the 11th king of Numenor, he had fortified the land of Mordor, and had built there the tower of Barad-dûr, and thereafter he strove ever for the dominion of Middle-earth, to become a king over all kings, and as a god unto men. And Sauron hated the Númenóreans, because of the deeds of their fathers, and their ancient alliance with the elves, and allegiance to the Valar. Nor did he forget the aid that Tar-Minastir had rendered to Gil-galad of old, in that time when the One Ring was forged, and there was war between Sauron and the elves and Eriador. Now he learned that the kings of Numenor had increased in power and splendor, and he hated them the more, and he feared them, lest they should invade his lands, and wrest from him the dominion of the east. But for a long time he did not dare to challenge the lords of the sea, and he withdrew from the coasts. Yet Sauron was ever guileful, and it is said that among those whom he ensnared with the 9 rings there were great lords of Númenórean race. And when the Uleri arose, that were the ring-wraiths, his servants, and the strength of his terror and mastery over men had grown exceedingly great, he began to assail the strong places of the Númenóreans upon the shores of the sea. In those days the shadow grew deeper upon Numenor, and the lives of the kings of the house of Elros waned because of their rebellion, and they hardened their hearts the more against the Valar. And the 20th king took the scepter of his fathers, and he ascended the throne in the name of Adunachor, Lord of the West, forsaking the elven tongues, and forbidding their use in his hearing. Yet in the scroll of kings the name Erennumen was inscribed in the high elven speech, because of ancient custom, which the kings feared to break utterly, lest evil befall. Now this title seemed to the faithful overproud, being the title of the Valar, and their hearts were sorely tried between their loyalty to the house of Elros and their reverence to the appointed powers. But worse was yet to come, for Ar-Gimilzor, the 23rd king, was the greatest enemy of the faithful. In his day the white tree was untended and began to decline, and he forbade utterly the use of the elven tongues, and punished those that welcomed the ships of Erisea that still came secretly to the west shores of the land. Now the Elendili dwelt mostly in the western regions of Numenor, but Ar-Gimilzor commanded all that he could discover to be of this party to remove from the west, and dwell in the east of the land, and there they were watched. And the chief dwelling of the faithful in the later days was thus nigh to the harbor of Romena. Thence many set sail to Middle-earth, seeking the northern coasts, where they might speak still with the Eldar in the kingdom of Gil-galad. This was known to the kings, but they hindered it not, so long as the Elendili departed from their land and did not return, for they desired to end all friendship between their people and the Eldar of Erisea, whom they named the spies of the Valar, hoping to keep their deeds and their counsels hidden from the lords of the west. But all that they did was known to Manwë, and the Valar were wroth with the kings of Numenor, and gave them counsel and protection no more, and the ships of Erisea came never again out of the sunset, and the havens of Anduni were forlorn. Highest in honor after the house of the kings are the lords of Anduni, for they were of the line of Elros, being descended from Silmarillion, daughter of Tar-Elendil, the 4th king of Numenor. And these lords were loyal to the kings, and revered them. and the Lord of Anduni was ever among the chief counselors of the scepter. Yet also from the beginning they bore a special love to the Eldar and reverence for the Valar. And as the shadow grew, they aided the faithful as they could. But for long they did not declare themselves openly, and sought rather to amend the hearts of the lords of the scepter with wiser counsels. There was a lady, Inzilbeth, renowned for her beauty, and her mother was Lindori, sister of Erendor, the lord of Anduni, in the days of Ar-Sakalthor, father of Ar-Gimilzor. Gimilzor took her to wife, though this was little to her liking, for she was in heart one of the faithful, being taught by her mother. But the kings and their sons were grown proud, and not to be gainsaid in their wishes. No love was there between Ar-Gimilzor and his queen, or between their sons. Inziladun the elder was like his mother in mind as in body, but Gimilkad the younger went with his father, unless he were yet prouder and more wilful. To him Ar-Gimilzor would have yielded the scepter rather than to the elder son, if the laws had allowed. But when Inzaladun acceded to the scepter, he took again a title in the elven tongues as of old, calling himself Tar-Palantir, for he was far-sighted both in eye and in mind, and even those that hated him feared his words as those of a true seer. He gave peace for a while to the faithful, and he went once more at due seasons to the Hallow of Eru upon the Meneltarma, which Ar-Gimilzor had forsaken. The white tree he tended again with honor, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of the kings come to its end. But his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar with the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. And Gimilkad was strong and ungentle, and he took the leadership of those that had been called the king's men, and opposed the will of his brother as openly as he dared, and yet more in secret. Thus the days of Tar-Palantir became darkened with grief, and he would spend much of his time in the west. And there ascended often the ancient tower of King Minastir upon the hill of Oromet, nigh to Anduni, whence he gazed westward in yearning, hoping to see maybe some sail upon the sea. But no ship came ever again from the west to Numenor, and Avalon was veiled in cloud. Now Gimilkad died 2 years before his 200th year, which was accounted an early death for one of Elros's line, even in its waning. But this brought no peace to the king, for Pharazôn, son of Gimilkad, had become a man yet more restless and eager for wealth and power than his father. He had fared often abroad as a leader in the wars that the Númenóreans made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men. And thus he had won great renown as a captain, both by land and by sea. Therefore when he came back to Númenor, hearing of his father's death, the hearts of the people were turned to him. For he brought with him great wealth, and was for the time free in his giving. And it came to pass that Tar-Palantir grew weary of grief and died. He had no son, but a daughter only, whom he named Miriel in the Elven tongue. And to her now by right and the laws of Númenóreans came the scepter. But Pharazôn took her to wife against her will, doing evil in this, and evil also in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. And when they were wedded, he seized the scepter into his own hand, taking the title of Ar-Pharazôn, Tar-Calion in the Elven tongue, and the name of his queen he changed to Ar-Zimrafel. The mightiest and proudest was Ar-Pharazôn the Golden of all those that had wielded the scepter of the sea kings since the foundation of Númenor, and 24 kings and queens had ruled the Númenóreans before, and slept now in their deep tombs under the Mount of Meneltarma, lying upon beds of gold. And sitting upon his carven throne in the city of Armenelos, in the glory of his power he brooded darkly, thinking of war. For he had learned in Middle-earth of the strength of the realm of Sauron, and of his hatred of Westerness. And now there came to him the masters of ships and captains, returning out of the east. And they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might, since Ar-Pharazôn had gone back from Middle-earth, and he was pressing down upon the cities by the coasts. And he had taken now the title of King of Men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenóreans into the sea, and destroy even Númenor, if that might be. Great was the anger of Ar-Pharazôn at these tidings, and as he pondered long in secret, his heart was filled with the desire of power unbounded, and the sole dominion of his will. And he determined without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of King of Men he would himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant. For in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Arendelle. Therefore he began in that time to smithy great hoards of weapons, and many ships of war he built, and stored them with his arms. And when all was made ready, he himself set sail with his hosts into the east. And men saw his sails coming up out of the sunset, dyed as with scarlet, and gleaming with red and gold, and fear fell upon the dwellers by the coasts, and they fled far away. But the fleet came at last to that place that was called Umbar, where was the mighty haven of the Númenóreans, that no hand had wrought. Empty and silent were all the lands about when the King of the Sea marched upon Middle-earth. For 7 days he journeyed with banner and trumpet, and he came to a hill, and went up, and he set there his pavilion and his throne. And he sat him down in the midst of the land, and the tents of his host were arranged all about him, blue, golden, and white, as a field of tall flowers. Then he sent forth heralds, and he commanded Sauron to come before him, and swear to him fealty. And Sauron came. Even from his mighty tower of Barad-dûr he came, and made no offer of battle, for he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumor of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them. And he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dunedain. And he was crafty, well skilled to gain what he would by subtlety, when force might not avail. Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn, and smoothed his tongue, and men wondered, for all that he said seemed fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that for the better keeping of Sauron, and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Númenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire. And Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Númenor, and on the city of Armenelos in the days of its glory, and he was astounded, but his heart within was filled the more with envy and hate. Yet such was the cunning of his mind and mouth, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he had become closest to the secret counsels of the king. For flattery, sweet as honey, was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things, yet unrevealed to men. And seeing the favor that he had of their lord, all the counselors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amendil, lord of Andúni. Then slowly a change came over the land, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear, And although those that remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. For now, having the ears of men, Sauron with many arguments gainsayed all that the Valar had taught, and he bade men think that in the world, in the east and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for their winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at the last come to the end of those lands and seas, beyond all lay the ancient darkness, and out of it the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful. And the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And our Pharazôn said, Who is the Lord of darkness? Then behind locked doors Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied, saying, It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people, and they for the most part followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful, as has been told, at Romena and in the country near, and other few there were here and there in the land. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amandil, counselor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion. Then young men by the reckoning of Númenor. Amandil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Eros, Tar Miniator, though not of the ruling house, to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armenelos. In the days of their youth together, Amandil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Númenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honor by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amandil withdrew to Romena, and all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret, for he feared that evil would now grow apace, and all the elf friends were in peril. And so it soon came to pass, for the Meneltarma was utterly deserted in those days, and though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king would let no man, upon pain of death, ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept Iluvatar in their hearts. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the fair, that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valinor. At the first the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree, as was forspoken by Tar Palantir. Thus in his folly he who now hated the Eldar and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Númenor. But when Amandil heard rumor of the evil purpose of Sauron, he was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron would surely have his will. Then he spoke to Elendil and the sons of Elendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Valinor. And Isildur said no word, but went out by night, and did a deed for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in disguise to Armenelos, and to the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful. And he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron, and the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At that time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, and its winter was nigh. And Isildur passed through the guards, and took from the tree a fruit that hung upon it, and turned to go. But the guard was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds. And he escaped, and because he was disguised it was not discovered who had laid hands on the tree. But Isildur came at last hardly back to Rowena, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amandil, ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amandil, and a shoot arose from it, and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaf opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose, and was troubled no more by his wounds. None too soon was this done, for after the assault the king yielded to Sauron, and felled the white tree, and turned then wholly away from the allegiance of his fathers. But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill, in the midst of the city of the Númenóreans, Armenelos the Golden, a mighty temple, and it was in the form of a circle at the base, and there the walls were 50 feet in thickness. And the width of the base was 500 feet across the center, and the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome, and that dome was roofed all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen far off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black, for there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a laver, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, as it crackled and was consumed. But men marveled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased, and in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release from them death. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims, yet never openly in the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. But for all this death did not depart from the land, rather it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful guises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and had laid them down in the end to sleep, when they were weary at last of the world, now madness and sickness assailed them, and yet they were afraid to die and go out into the dark, the realm of the Lord that they had taken, and they cursed themselves in their agony. And men took weapons in those days, and slew one another for little cause. For they were become quick to anger, and Sauron, or those whom he had bound to himself, went about the land, setting men against men, so that the people murmured against the king and their lords, or against any that had aught that they had not, and the men of power took cruel revenge. Nonetheless, for long it seemed to the Númenóreans that they prospered, and if they were not increased in happiness, yet they grew more strong, and their rich men grew even richer. For with the aid and counsel of Sauron they multiplied their possessions, and they devised engines, and they built ever greater ships, and they sailed now with power and armory to Middle-earth, and they came no longer as bringers of gifts, nor even as rulers, but as fierce men of war. And they hunted the men of Middle-earth, and took their goods and enslaved them, and many they slew cruelly upon their altars, for they built in the fortresses temples and great tombs in those days. And men feared them, and the memory of the kindly kings of the ancient days faded from the world, and was darkened by many a tale of dread. Thus Ar-Pharazôn, king of the land of the star, grew to the mightiest tyrant that had yet been in the world since the reign of Morgoth, though in truth Sauron ruled all from behind the throne. But the years passed, and the king felt the shadow of death approach, as his days lengthened, and he was filled with fear and wrath. Now came the hour that Sauron had prepared and long had awaited, and Sauron spoke to the king, saying that his strength was now so great that he might think to have his will in all things, and be subject to no command or ban. And he said, "The Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it, hiding it as best they may, because of their avarice, and their fear lest the kings of men should wrest from them the deathless realm, and rule the world in their stead. And though doubtless the gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage, yet against all justice is it done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, Ar-Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due." Then Ar-Pharazôn, being besotted, and walking under the shadow of death, for his span was drawing towards its end, hearkened to Sauron, and he began to ponder in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar. He was long preparing this design, and he spoke not openly of it, yet it could not be hidden from all. And Amandil, becoming aware of the purposes of the king, was dismayed and filled with a great dread, for he knew that men could not vanquish the Valar in war, and that ruin must come upon the world if this war were not stayed. Therefore he called his son Elendil, and he said to him, "The days are dark, and there is no hope for men, for the faithful are few. Therefore I am minded to try that counsel which our forefather Eärendil took of old, to sail into the west, be there ban or no, and to speak to the Valar, even to Manwë himself, if may be, and beseech his aid ere all is lost." "Would you then betray the king?" said Elendil, "for you know well the charge that they make against us, that we are traitors and spies, and that until this day it has been false." "If I thought that Manwë needed such a messenger," said Amandil, "I would betray the king. For there is but one loyalty from which no man can be absolved in heart for any cause, but it is for mercy upon men and their deliverance from Sauron, the deceiver, that I would plead, since some at least have remained faithful. And as for the ban, I will suffer in myself the penalty, lest all my people should become guilty. But what think you my father is like to befall all those of your house whom you leave behind when your deed becomes known?" "It must not become known," said Amandil. "I will prepare my going in secret, and I will set sail into the east, whither daily the ships depart from our havens, and thereafter, as wind and chance may allow, I will go about through south or north, back into the west, and seek what I may find. But for you and your folk, my son, I counsel that you should prepare yourselves other ships, and put aboard all such things as your hearts cannot bear to part with. And when the ships are ready, you should lie in the haven of Romena, and give out among men that you propose, when you see your time, to follow me into the east. Amandil is no longer so dear to our kinsmen upon the throne that he will grieve overmuch if we seek to depart, for a season or for good. But let it not be seen that you intend to take many men, or he will be troubled, because of the war that he now plots, for which he will need all the force he may gather. Seek out the faithful that are known still to be true, and let them join you in secret, if they are willing to go with you and share in your design." "And what shall that design be?" said Elendil. "To meddle not in the war, and to watch," said Amandil. "Until I return I can say no more, but it is most likely that you shall fly from the land of the star with no star to guide you, for that land is defiled. Then you shall lose all that you have loved, foretasting death in life, seeking a land of exile elsewhere. but east or west the Valar alone can say. Then Amandil said farewell to all his household, as one that is about to die. For, said he, it may well prove that you will see me never again, and that I shall show you no such sign as Eärendil showed long ago. But hold you ever in readiness, for the end of the world that we have known is now at hand. It is said that Amandil set sail in a small ship at night, and steered first eastward, and then went about and passed into the west. And he took with him 3 servants, dear to his heart, and never again were they heard of by word or sign in this world, nor is there any tale or guess of their fate. Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Númenor there was no easy absolving. But Elendil did all that his father had bidden, and his ships lay off the east coast of the land. And the faithful put aboard their wives and their children, and their heirlooms, and great stores of goods. Many things there were of beauty and power, such as the Númenóreans had contrived in the days of their wisdom, vessels and jewels, and scrolls of lore, written in scarlet and black. And 7 stones they had, the gift of the Eldar, but in the ship of Isildur was guarded the young tree, the scion of Nimloth the fair. Thus Elendil held himself in readiness, and did not meddle in the evil deeds of those days, and ever he looked for a sign that did not come. Then he journeyed in secret to the western shores and gazed out over the sea, for sorrow and yearning were upon him, and he greatly loved his father. But naught could he descry save the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn, gathering in the havens of the west. Now aforetime in the Isle of Númenor the weather was ever apt to the needs and liking of men, rain in due season and ever in measure, and sunshine now warmer, now cooler, and winds from the sea. And when the wind was in the west, it seemed to many that it was filled with a fragrance, fleeting but sweet, heart-stirring, as of flowers that bloom forever in undying meads, and have no names from mortal shores. But all this was now changed, for the sky itself was darkened, and there were storms of rain and hail in those days, and violent winds, and ever and anon a great ship of the Númenóreans would founder and return not to haven, though such a grief had not till then befallen them since the rising of the star. And out of the west there would come at times a great cloud in the evening, shaped as it were an eagle, with pinions spread to the north and the south, and slowly it would loom up, blotting out the sunset, and then uttermost night would fall upon Númenor, and some of the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings, and thunder echoed between sea and cloud. Then men grew afraid. Behold, the eagles of the land of the west, they cried. The eagles of Manwë are come upon Númenor, and they fell upon their faces. Then some few would repent for a season, but others hardened their hearts, and they shook their fists at heaven, saying, The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first. The next blow shall be ours. These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightnings increased, and slew men upon the hills, and in the fields, and in the streets of the city, and a fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple, and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle, and defied the lightning, and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god, and did all that he would. When therefore the last portent came, they heeded it little, for the land shook under them, and a groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the sea, and smoke issued from the peak of the Meneltarma. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armament. In that time the fleets of the Númenóreans darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black, and all things waited upon the word of Ar-Pharazôn. And Sauron withdrew into the inmost circle of the temple, and men brought him victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came up out of the dayfall, and they were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line, the end of which diminished beyond sight. And as they came, their wings spread ever wider, grasping the sky. But the west burned red behind them, and they glowed beneath, as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all Númenóreans were illumined as with a smoldering fire. And men looked upon the faces of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath. Then Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart, and he went aboard his mighty ship, Alcarondas, castle of the sea. Many oared it was, and many masted, golden and sable, and upon it the throne of Ar-Pharazôn was set. Then he did on his panoply and his crown, and let raise his standard, and he gave the signal for the raising of the anchors. And in that hour the trumpets of the Númenor outrang the thunder. Thus the fleets of the Númenóreans moved against the menace of the west, and there was little wind, but they had many oars and many strong slaves to row beneath the lash. The sun went down, and there came a great silence. Darkness fell upon the land, and the sea was still, while the world waited for what should betide. Slowly the fleet passed out of the sight of the watchers in the havens, and their lights faded, and night took them. And in the morning they were gone, for a wind arose in the east, and it wafted them away. And they broke the band of the Valar, and sailed into forbidden seas, going up with war against the deathless, to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came up out of the deeps of the sea, that encompassed Avalon and all the isle of Erisea, and the Eldar mourned, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Númenóreans. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the blessed realm, and the coasts of Valinor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores, and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Iluvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship, and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. And a host of the Númenóreans encamped in might about Tuna, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Iluvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Iluvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the deathless lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken, and all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king, and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman, were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the forgotten, until the last battle in the day of doom. But the land of Aman and Erisea of the Eldar were taken away and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Andor, the land of gift, Númenor of the kings, Elena of the star of Eärendil, was utterly destroyed, for it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding, where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Iluvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished, for Valinor and Erisea were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. In an hour unlooked for by men this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Numenor went down into the sea, with all its children and its wives and its maidens and its ladies proud, and all its gardens and its halls and its towers, its tombs and its riches, and its jewels and its webs and its things, painted and carven, and its laughter and its mirth and its music, its wisdom and its lore, they vanished forever. And last of all the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tarmiriel the queen, fairer than silver, ivory, or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost to the roaring of the wind. But whether or no it were that Amandil came indeed to Valinor, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer, by grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Romena, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple, he went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on a time. There he was protected by the land from the great drought of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when the devouring wave rolled over the land, and Numenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed, and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day. But the great wind took him, wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships far away, and it rent their sails and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water. 9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2. And they fled before the black gate, out of the twilight of doom, into the darkness of the world. And the deeps rose beneath them in towering anger, and waves like unto mountains, moving with great caps of writhen snow, bore them up amid the wreckage of the clouds, and after many days cast them away upon the shores of Middle-earth. And all the coasts and seaward regions of the western world suffered great change and ruin in that time, for the seas invaded the lands, and shores foundered, and ancient isles were drowned, and new isles were uplifted, and hills crumbled, and rivers were turned into strange courses. Elendil and his sons after founded the kingdoms in Middle-earth, and though their lord craft was but an echo of that which had been, ere Sauron came to Numenor, yet very great it seemed to the wild men of the world. And much is said in other lore of the deeds of the heirs of Elendil in that age that came after, and of their strife with Sauron that not yet was ended. For Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon the sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenóreans and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle, and again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm, and a third time even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking that he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever. He was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat in his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep, and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth, and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible. In the eye of Sauron the terrible few could endure. But these things come not into the tale of the drowning of Númenor, of which now all is told, and even the name of that land perished, and men spoke thereafter not of Elena, nor of Andor the gift that was taken away, nor of Númenor on the confines of the world. But the exiles on the shores of the sea, if they turned towards the west, in the desire of their hearts, spoke of Mar Nufanamar, that was whelmed in the waves, Akalabeth, the downfallen, Atalante, in the Eldarin tongue. Among the exiles many believed that the summit of the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, was not drowned forever, but rose again above the waves, a lonely island lost in the great waters, for it had been a hallowed place, and even in the days of Sauron none had defiled it. And some there were of the seed of Randil that afterwards sought for it, because it was said among lore-masters that the far-sighted men of old could see from the Meneltarma a glimmer of the deathless land. For even after the ruin, the hearts of the Dunedain were still set westwards, and though they knew indeed that the world was changed, they said, Avalon is vanished from the earth, and the land of Aman is taken away, and in the world of this present darkness they cannot be found. Yet once they were, and therefore they still are, in true being, and in the whole shape of the world as at first it was devised. For the Dunedain held that even mortal men, if so blessed, might look upon other times than those of their body's life, and they longed ever to escape from the shadow of their exile, and to see in some fashion the light that dies not. For the sorrow of the thought of death had pursued them over the deeps of the sea. Thus it was that great mariners among them would still search the empty seas, hoping to come upon the isle of Meneltarma, and there to see a vision of things that were, but they found it not. And those that sailed far came only to the new lands, and found them like to the old lands, and subject to death. And those that sailed furthest set but a girdle about the earth, and returned weary at last to the place of their beginning, and they said, all roads are now bent. Thus in after days, what by the voyage of ships, what by lore and starcraft the kings of men knew, that the world was indeed made round, and yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart, and to come to the ancient west, and to Avalon, if they would. Therefore the lore-masters of men said that a straight road must still be, for those that were permitted to find it. And they taught that while the new world fell away, the old road and the path of the memory of the West still went on, as it were a mighty bridge invisible that passed through the air of breath and of flight, which were bent now as the world was bent, and traversed Ilmen, with which flesh unaided cannot endure, until it come to Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, and maybe even beyond to Valinor, where the Valar still dwell and watch the unfolding of the story of the world. And tales and rumors arose along the shores of the sea concerning mariners and men forlorn upon the water, who, by some fate or grace or favor of the Valar, had entered in upon the straight way, and seen the face of the world sink below them, and so had come to the lamplit quays of Avalon, or verily to the last beaches on the margin of Aman, and there had looked upon the white mountain, dreadful and beautiful, before they died. Please purchase your own copy of the Silmarillion. This is just a reading.